Okay, let's unpack this. When you hear the name Rolex, what immediately comes to mind? For many, it's luxury, prestige, maybe a symbol of unparalleled success.
Definitely. We're talking about a brand valued at what? Around $8 billion today? It's just synonymous with status and precision, worldwide.
Absolutely. But behind that iconic name and, well, that immense value lies an origin story that is, frankly, pretty incredible.
Yeah.
It started over a century ago, and not with some established watchmaking dynasty, but, believe it or not, with an orphan boy.
And what's really fascinating about this journey, especially looking at the material we've got here, is that it's so much more than just a business history, isn't it?
Oh, for sure.
It's this profound tale of resilience, some really remarkable foresight, and just a relentless drive for innovation against what must have seemed like, well, insurmountable odds back then.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we're diving into today. This deep dive is all about the captivating history of Rolex, but we're really focusing in on its founder, Hans Wilsdorf, and tracing his extraordinary path from facing, profound loss really early in life to building the global empire we recognize today.
And our mission here, just to be clear, is anchored entirely to the source material you shared with us.
Right.
Specifically, we're working from these excerpts of a YouTube transcript titled The Orphan Boy Who Created Rolex.
Yep, that's the one.
So we're going to meticulously, try to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight presented right there in that source, uncover the surprising facts it contains, and trace that defining path, the innovation, the resilience, the strategic vision that really shaped Wilsdorf and the actual creation of Rolex. Everything we discuss is going to be drawn directly from that information.
Right. We're sticking strictly to what's in our stack, no going off pistic. So let's begin at the very beginning of this remarkable story, exploring the unlikely and definitely challenging beginnings of Hans Wilsdorf himself.
Okay, so the source material kicks off by telling us Hans Wilsdorf was born March 22, 1881. His birthplace was a town called Kumbach in Germany. His parents were Anna and Johann Daniel Wilsdorf, and he was the second of 3 kids.
Right. And the family had a business.
Yeah, the source mentions a family business passed down from his grandfather, actually. They sold iron goods, and the source describes them as being middle-range class.
So a fairly solid, respectable, middle-class start in life.
Seems that way.
Okay.
But that stability, well, it didn't last. The source states tragedy struck, and it struck swiftly and brutally.
His mother first.
Yes, his mother, Anna, became ill and passed away in 1892. And then just adding this immense layer of loss, his father, Johann Daniel, died only a year later in 1893.
Wow. So by the age of 12, he's orphaned.
Exactly. Just 12 years old. An incredibly tough situation for anyone, let alone a child that age.
Unimaginable.
And the source explains that after this, he was placed under the care and custody of his mother's brothers, so his uncles.
Okay, his uncles take him in.
Yeah.
And what did they do, according to the source? Did they try to keep the family business going?
No, actually, the source states one of their immediate actions was to sell the family business.
Really? Just like that?
Apparently so. It wasn't kept within the family after the parents passed.
And what about the children themselves? Hans and his siblings.
Well, the material explains the uncles used some of the money from selling the business for the kids' education. Their decision was to place all 3 Wilsdorf siblings into quite a prestigious boarding school.
Okay, which one?
It was called Ernestanum Coburg, located in Bavaria, Germany. So it seems like their priority was, ensuring the children got a good education, even if it meant this really drastic change in their lives.
Sending them away to boarding school. How did Hans react to that? I mean, after everything.
Yeah, the source is pretty clear about his initial reaction. It says Hans absolutely hated the decision, hated being sent away.
I can imagine.
This period was marked by some significant emotional distress for him. The source mentions he became depressed. He felt like a total outsider in this new environment. And the source specifically notes he was often teased by the other boys, particularly because of his religion. So it wasn't just a change of scenery. It was a period of really profound isolation and difficulty for him.
That's completely understandable given everything he'd just been through. Losing both parents, separated from home, sent to this unfamiliar, possibly hostile place. That's a lot for a 12-year-old to process.
Absolutely.
So how did he cope? How did he manage in that tough environment, according to the source?
Well, the source highlights a key coping mechanism, one that actually proved pretty formative for him later on.
Oh, yeah?
To navigate this really challenging childhood, he decided to just channel all his energy and focus entirely on his schoolwork.
Threw himself into his studies.
Right.
Did it work? Did this focus lead to academic success?
It absolutely did. The material notes he became quite a bright and diligent student. He didn't just scrape by, he really excelled.
In any particular subjects.
According to the source, yeah. He notably excelled in mathematics and languages. He learned both French and English while he was at the school.
Languages. Turns out to be pretty important later, doesn't it?
Crucial. And the source adds this detail. It mentions he was always curious about the world and travel, and he sort of intuitively understood that these language skills would be incredibly useful for his future, especially in his career.
That's quite insightful for a young kid, that foresight about the practical value of languages.
It really is. It points to a pragmatic mind developing quite early on. And the source tells us that later in life, Hans actually reflected on this period, even the painful parts.
He did. What did he say?
Well, he came to understand that even though he initially really resented his uncle's decision and the sort of forced self-reliance it brought, it actually became a critical factor in his eventual success. The source includes this quote from Hans Wilsdorf himself that really captures this realization. He said, "Our uncles were not indifferent to our fate.
Okay.
Nevertheless, the way in which they made me become self-reliant very early in life made me acquire the habit of looking after my possessions, and looking back, I believe that it is to this that much of my success is due."
Wow. That quote offers a really powerful insight, doesn't it?
It really does.
It suggests that being thrust into that situation where he had to depend on himself, look after his own things, his own future, it cultivated this habit of diligence and care that he directly links to his later achievements.
Exactly. It kind of reframes that adversity, not just as a hardship, but as a crucible, something that forged key aspects of his character.
Yeah, foundational is the word. The source presents this period as difficult, certainly, but also foundational.
Despite the personal pain, that intense focus on education, especially practical skills like languages and math, combined with that enforced self-reliance, it created a really strong foundation for whatever came next.
And what came next soon propelled him towards a very specific, and for him, completely fascinating path into the world of watches.
Yeah, the watch world. So how did that first capture his imagination? What does the source say?
Well, the material explains that during his time at boarding school, he became friends with a Swiss boy.
Ah, okay.
And this friend shared stories about his home region,
Which was?
Le Chaux de Fonds in Switzerland.
Right. And the source points out that Le Chaux de Fonds wasn't just any city. It was, and still is, a city renowned for its long, deep history in the watchmaking industry.
The heart of Swiss watchmaking, essentially.
Pretty much. And hearing these stories from his friend about the center of horological craft, it just sparked this strong interest, this intrigue in Hans. He became very curious about the place.
And that intrigue stuck with him, because the source tells us that at some point, Hans decided he'd had enough of boarding school life, enough of Germany.
Yeah, he made a decisive move. He left Germany entirely and relocated to Geneva, Switzerland. This was when he was still pretty young, only 19.
19, okay. And his first job in Geneva.
Yeah.
It wasn't watches straight away, was it?
No, not quite yet. The source states his first position there was as an apprentice for an international company involved in exporting pearls.
Pearls. That seems quite a leap from watches. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What did he learn there, according to the source? Did it teach him anything useful?
Well, the source describes the company's business model. They'd buy pearls from various markets, then they'd process them, sorting, grading, packaging them up for sale to jewelers.
Okay.
And what Hans observed, and the source highlights this as significant, was that this company wasn't actually making anything from scratch. They weren't creating a product in the traditional sense.
Right, just trading and adding value.
Exactly. Yet they were making substantial profits through this trade and the value-added services like sorting and grading. This observation led him to really immerse himself, learn their business tactics. And the source also notes he was making pretty good money for someone his age.
So even though it wasn't watches, he was getting this valuable, practical education in international trade, business operations, and, crucially, how to make money without actually manufacturing.
Precisely. It was a practical step, gave him crucial business acumen, which really complemented the language and math skills he'd already developed.
But that initial intrigue about watches, about Le Chaux de Fonds, that hadn't gone away.
Not at all. It was still there. The source recounts that one day, Hans received a letter from that old friend from school.
Ah, the Swiss friend, offering him a job.
Yes. The job offer was from a company called Kuno Korten.
Kuno Korten.
And the source describes Kuno Korten as one of the biggest high-quality watchmaking businesses operating at that time. They were significant players, exporting something like 1 million Swiss francs worth of pocket watches annually. And they were also involved in producing some watches from scratch.
Wow, okay. A major player. And where was this company based?
Crucially, it was located in Le Chaux-de-Fonds,
The very place.
the very city that Hans had been intrigued by for years, the heart of Swiss watchmaking he wanted to see.
So he had a choice. Stay in Geneva, making good money at the Pearl Company, gaining solid business experience, or take this opportunity potentially for less money, but get directly into the industry that fascinated him and the place that held all this interest.
And according to the source, his deep curiosity for Le Chaux-de-Fonds and the watch business itself just won out. It was stronger than the immediate financial benefit of his current job.
He followed his passion.
Seems like it. Drawn by this passion, he made the decision to move and accept the job at Kuno Korten. This was in the year 1900.
Okay, 1900. What was his actual role there? What did they hire him to do?
He was hired as an English correspondent and clerk,
Using those language skills again?
directly leveraging the English he'd learned back at boarding school. His monthly salary, the source notes, was 80 Swiss francs.
80 Swiss francs, which, as you said, sounds like it might have been less than the Pearl job.
Probably was, yeah.
But what was he doing day to day, winding watches?
Well, yeah. The source details his daily responsibilities, and this is where the really deep learning happened. He was responsible for winding literally hundreds of pocket watches every single day and meticulously verifying their accuracy. Through this constant hands-on work, he gained just tremendous insight into the real nitty-gritty of watchmaking. He picked up significant knowledge about how all different types of watches were produced, not just the fancy high-end ones.
So those early mornings winding watches weren't just boring clerical work. They were like an immersive, practical education in the mechanics and performance of timepieces. He was absorbing the core of the craft right there.
Exactly. He wasn't just observing business tactics anymore, he was learning the product, inside and out. This period was just invaluable for building his foundational knowledge in horology.
But his time there was cut short, only 2 years.
Yeah, relatively short. The source states that after only 2 years at Kuno Korten, he had to return to Germany.
Why?
To fulfill his obligation for army service.
Okay, so another interruption in his burgeoning watch career, but definitely not the end of his ambitions, clearly.
Not by a long shot.
Okay, so after completing his army service, the source tells us that Hans, now aged 22, makes his way to London, England.
Yes, another strategic move, this time to a major international market. In London, the source says he secured a position with another company that specialized in high-quality watches.
And a bigger role this time.
Yeah, more significant than just being a clerk. He was put in charge of increasing their sales.
Okay, so now he's applying those business and sales skills he started developing back in Geneva, combined with his deeper watch knowledge.
Precisely. And the material indicates he was pretty good at it. During his 2 years there, he successfully expanded their client base and significantly grew their sales volume over time. He was proving he could not only understand watches, but also sell them effectively.
And all this time, while working, gaining experience in London, his mind was already looking ahead, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. The source explicitly states that during these years, he was already seriously contemplating and planning to build his own watch business. He was soaking up everything he could, furthering his knowledge specifically with his own future venture in mind.
London seems like it was this period of really refining his vision, accumulating the necessary experience to knowledge.
Definitely. And it was during these years in London that a really crucial personal connection was made, one that would directly enable his entrepreneurial dream.
His wife.
Yes, he met his future wife, Florence Frances May Crotty. The source mentions they married shortly after meeting.
And this marriage brought him into contact with another key figure, right? Her brother.
Yes, exactly. The source describes this pivotal conversation Hans had with his wife's much older brother, Alfred James Davis. They were just talking about life, future plans,
And what did Hans share with Alfred in that chat?
Well, Hans, feeling, ready and confident, he confided in Alfred that he felt prepared to start his own watch business. He had the knowledge, the vision.
But not the cash.
Exactly. The source notes that his only missing piece was the necessary capital to actually get it off the ground.
And Alfred's reaction, was he receptive?
The source highlights that Alfred Davis had the financial means Hans needed. And importantly, Alfred saw Hans's genuine passion, his confidence about watches, despite him being relatively young.
So he took a chance on him.
He did. Alfred was willing to take that chance. The material simply states they agreed to help with the business venture. Alfred was ready to invest his money.
Just like that. A handshake.
It sounds like it was pretty straightforward. The source marks this moment clearly. They shook hands, and in 1905, they officially founded Wilsdorf and Davis Limited.
Wilsdorf and Davis Limited.
And this company, the source confirms, was the direct precursor to what would eventually become the Rolex we know. So the whole empire basically began with that handshake, rooted in trust and Alfred's investment.
Wilsdorf and Davis Limited, founded in 1905.
Oh.
Okay, what was their initial business strategy? What did they actually do, according to the source?
Well, the source tells us that within a few years of founding the company, they set up a partnership with a Swiss watch company. Name was Hermann Agler, based back in Switzerland.
Okay, a Swiss partner. How did that partnership work in practice for Wilsdorf and Davis over London?
The material explains their system. They would import watch movements from Switzerland, specifically from their partner Hermann Agler, into England.
Right.
Once these movements arrived in London, they would then place them into watch cases. So their model was really focused on assembly and distribution, using these high-quality Swiss components.
And to support this, the source mentioned they also opened an office back in Switzerland itself.
Yeah, they opened an office in Biel, Switzerland. This move likely helped, facilitate the smooth import of movements from Agler.
Made sense.
And the source notes that soon after establishing this partnership and structure, Wilsdorf and Davis began specializing in the distribution of timepieces. Initially, they were focusing on affordable rates.
Affordable. Interesting.
Yeah, so the early emphasis seems to have been on providing accessible, quality timepieces by combining that Swiss manufacturing prowess with their assembly and distribution network based in England.
Okay, now despite this growing success, getting the business off the ground, Hans, as this passionate watch lover, the source points out he identified something major in the industry at the time that he found fundamentally, unfavorable.
Yeah, this is where his really revolutionary vision starts to take shape, isn't it? The source states that at this time, pocket watches were just overwhelmingly the standard. That was the norm for telling time.
Right. And wristwatches, how were they perceived then? They existed, didn't they?
Oh, they existed, yeah. But according to the material, they were primarily worn by women, usually as decorative jewelry.
Oh, like bracelets with a clock face?
Kind of, yeah. And they were often looked down upon by some, particularly by men and anyone who really valued precise timekeeping.
And the source explains why they were looked down upon. What was the issue?
Yeah, the primary reason given in the source is that they just weren't considered precise or reliable enough for everyday use. They were much smaller than pocket watches, and consequently, they used much smaller movements. And the source notes that because of the complexities and limitations of these tiny movements back then, the watches would frequently run either too fast or too slow. They just lacked that consistent accuracy needed for serious timekeeping.
Okay. So the technical challenge of shrinking down an accurate movement was the main barrier. Pocket watches were bigger, so they could have more robust, accurate mechanisms.
That's basically the implication from the source, yeah. This technical gap was the main reason pocket watches were more popular. And, the source adds, they were considered more masculine, partly because of their larger, bulkier size.
But Hans's perspective was different. He wasn't just focused on the technical limitations or, the prevailing social norms. He saw something else.
No, exactly. For Hans personally, the source says he found pocket watches simply inconvenient to use.
Inconvenient?
Yeah, the material describes his view, saying it was a little hassle for him every time he had to reach his hand in the pocket in order to see the time, especially when his hands were busy.
That's such a practical, almost obvious observation when you think about it.
Right, yeah.
It makes perfect sense. Imagine trying to check the time while you're working with your hands, or riding a bike, or, as became relevant later, in a military context.
Mm-hmm.
Pocket watches require that distinct action reach, pull out, maybe open a cover that just isn't always feasible or easy.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes that up until that point, it was widely thought to be almost impossible to create a truly perfect wristwatch, one that could consistently show the exact time and be robust enough for everyday, practical use. That was the prevailing technical and cultural view he was up against.
But Hans had this extraordinary foresight. The source includes a quote from him, apparently from as early as 1914, that just dramatically illustrates this vision.
What did he say?
He said, "My personal opinion is that pocket watches will almost completely disappear and that wristwatches will replace them definitively."
Wow. 1914, that is a remarkable statement for that time, isn't it? When wristwatches were seen as these delicate, imprecise bits of jewelry, for him to not only predict their rise, but the near extinction of the dominant pocket watch, that shows such a deep conviction in the potential he saw that almost everyone else missed.
It wasn't just wishful thinking.
No, it sounds like a prediction based on his understanding of utility and maybe technical possibility.
And he wasn't just making predictions, he was actively working to make it happen. The source says he was fully committed to finding a way to create this perfect wristwatch to overcome those technical challenges.
Yeah, to chase that goal, the source tells us he dedicated several years to some intense research and learning. He traveled extensively across Europe, meeting with countless watchmakers.
Just picking their brains.
Pretty much. The purpose of these meetings, according to the material, was to discuss all the small details of watches, learn everything he could about the intricate mechanics, and figure out how to improve them, particularly for those smaller movements needed in wristwatches.
But he wasn't waiting around to perfect it before releasing anything, though. The source says he started putting his own wristwatches out there surprisingly early.
Yeah, he began releasing his own wristwatch designs the very same year he founded Wilsdorf and Davis back in 1905.
Really? Right from the start?
Seems so. The source describes his process during this period as crafting watches one after another, just relentlessly focused on creating a better, higher quality, more reliable wristwatch, applying whatever knowledge he was gaining from his travels and talks with other watchmakers.
So it wasn't just waiting for one big breakthrough. It was this ongoing, iterative process of improvement right from the beginning.
Exactly. And this relentless focus on the wristwatch, combined with their early distribution business model, it started to gain some real traction.
The company started growing.
It did. The source mentions that soon after its founding and this focus on wristwatches, the company began to see significant growth and recognition in the market.
To the point where, by 1908, the source indicates Wilsdorf and Davis Limited had achieved a pretty remarkable position.
Yeah, by just 1908, that's only 3 years after starting the source, states the company had become one of the top firms in the watchmaking industry within England.
That's incredibly fast growth.
It really is. Fueled, it seems, by their focus on this emerging wristwatch market and their, smart distribution network.
Okay, so the company's growing, gaining prominence by 1908. And Hans decides it's time for a fundamental change, something that would define the brand forever. The source says he wanted to change the company name from Wilsdorf and Davis.
Yeah, and he had a very specific vision for this new name. The source material outlines several qualities he was looking for.
Like what?
He wanted a name that felt high class, something catchy, and crucially, a name that would be easy to say and remember no matter what language someone spoke. Really international.
Makes sense for a global ambition, and maybe most practically for a watch company, it needed a specific physical characteristic, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The source points out the essential practical requirement. The name needed to be short.
Short enough to fit on the dial.
Exactly. Short enough to fit neatly and legibly on the small dial of a wristwatch. That was a direct design constraint influencing his whole search.
So, how did he actually arrive at the name Rolex? The source describes his process. Was it just a flash of inspiration?
Not quite. The material tells us he spent a considerable amount of time on this creative process, literally combining different letter combinations. He was specifically focused, apparently, on using only 5 letters from the alphabet to keep it short and impactful.
Just trying out combinations. A, B, C.
Something like that. And after this period of searching and combining, finally, the name Rolex was born from this process.
And his reaction when he hit upon Rolex, did he know immediately?
The source says there was this immediate sense of certainty. He knew instantly it was the perfect one. It just hit all his criteria: short, catchy, easy to say across languages, and it felt inherently high class.
He didn't hang about securing it either.
Not at all. The source notes that just a few days after finding the name, back in 1908, he took the crucial step of registering Rolex as a trademark for Wilsdorf and Davis Limited. That secured the name's identity for his company.
Smart move. And over the next few years, the reputation of this newly trademarked name started to grow.
Yeah, the source indicates that Rolex quickly became known for its high-quality wristwatches. And who were the early adopters? The material mentions that many rich people started using them.
Okay. So from those relatively early days, the brand was already beginning to establish that association with quality and desirability among a pretty affluent clientele.
Seems that way, yeah.
Things were progressing well, strong name, growing reputation, focus on the future of timekeeping. But then, shortly after gaining this momentum, this massive global event erupted, something that would dramatically alter the course of history, and surprisingly, the course of Rolex, too.
Yeah, that event was the outbreak of World War I. And the source describes the challenging environment this created for businesses. It states that many firms, including established watch companies, really struggled immensely. Some were even forced to shut down entirely because of the economic disruption, the uncertainty of the war.
But the source highlights a really paradoxical effect for Rolex during this tragic period. It wasn't all bad for them.
It's strange, isn't it? The material notes that not Rolex suffered in the same way. Instead, this tragic event only made Hans' company more famous, according to the source. It's a very counterintuitive outcome.
More famous because of the war. Why? How did that happen?
Well, the source provides a clear explanation, and it links directly back to Hans Wilsdorf's earlier foresight and his technical focus on the wristwatch.
Okay.
Because Rolex already had this established reputation for reliable wristwatches, their watches were chosen for use by military personnel. The source states that many soldiers were given Rolex watches instead of the traditional pocket watches.
Oh, okay. And what advantage did the wristwatch offer soldiers in the field, according to the source? Why choose Rolex?
The source emphasizes the practical benefits. It was just much easier and safer to use in the demanding conditions of warfare compared to, fumbling with a pocket watch in the trenches.
Yeah, I could see that.
And crucially, the source notes its precision was vital. It also helped them to better coordinate their attacks, because having reliable, easily accessible timekeeping was absolutely essential for synchronized maneuvers. The battlefield basically became this unexpected, large-scale proving ground for the wristwatch's superior utility.
So the war effectively proved his prediction about the wristwatch's practicality wasn't just right for, say, businessmen, but for anyone needing time with their hands free, even in the most extreme circumstances.
Precisely. And this wartime demand, coupled with the proven utility in the field, it led to significant growth for the company. The source states that by 1914, Rolex had grown to employ 60 people.
60 people?
Yeah, and they occupied large, open office spaces in London. That's pretty substantial growth.
And they'd already laid a foundation of technical credibility before the war amplified their practical use, right?
Mm-hmm.
The source mentioned some important certifications.
That's a really good point. Yes, the material notes that prior to the war really boosting its fame, Rolex had already taken steps to solidify its technical credibility. They had won the first ever wristwatch chronometer rating from Switzerland.
Which is a big deal, right?
Yeah.
A chronometer rating for a wristwatch back then.
Huge deal. It signified a verifiable standard of timekeeping accuracy for a wristwatch, something previously associated mainly with larger pocket watches or marine chronometers.
And they followed that up with recognition in London, too.
Yes, according to the source, this was followed by achieving a Class S certificate of precision from London's Kew Observatory, often called the Kew Observatory.
Right.
The source states that earning these really rigorous certifications significantly increased the brand's trustworthiness in the eyes of potential buyers. It wasn't just Hans saying his watches were reliable anymore. Independent bodies were certifying their precision.
And then the war provided the dramatic real-world proof of that certified reliability.
Exactly. It all kind of came together.
But even with this success, the wartime boost, the path wasn't entirely smooth for Hans and Rolex, was it? The source indicates new challenges were emerging around 1914.
That's right. The source notes that, not everything was sunshine and rainbows, despite the wartime popularity. A significant business challenge popped up in 1914 when the British government implemented a new tax.
Taxes. What did this tax involve?
According to the source, the British applied a pretty substantial 33% tax.
33%?
Yeah, 33% on all companies registered in Great Britain that were exporting goods across international borders.
Ouch. And for Wilsdorf and Davis, who were, as we said, importing Swiss movements into England and then exporting finished watches back out to Europe and other markets, that must have been a direct and painful financial hit.
Oh, absolutely. The source describes this as a big concern for Hans, directly impacting their core assembly and distribution model. His response was swift and pretty strategic.
What does he do?
He decided to move the company's headquarters out of London and back to Bilbien in Switzerland, specifically to avoid these significant taxes.
Okay, so the tax was a major driver for relocating the base of operations. But the source also mentions another factor, maybe more personal, that pressured this move as well.
Yes, the material points out that because of the ongoing World War I, there was this growing anti-German sentiment among the public in Britain.
Right. Understandable during wartime, but difficult for him personally.
Exactly. The source highlights that Hans Wilsdorf's name was clearly German, and even though the Rolex trademark was in use, the company was still officially known as Wilsdorf and Davis in England. And this name was starting to be viewed negatively because of the prevailing wartime attitudes.
So facing both a heavy tax burden and this personal prejudice linked to his name, the move back to Switzerland became even more necessary.
It really did. And the source indicates that this pressure, combined with the relocation, finally led him to formally change the company name altogether.
To just Rolex.
Yes. In 1915, he completely switched the official name from Wilsdorf and Davis Limited to the Rolex Watch Corporation Limited. This fully embraced the Rolex brand name he had created years earlier and ditched the name that was causing issues.
Makes sense.
Ah.
And after solidifying the name, the iconic visual symbol of the brand followed soon after.
Okay.
Crown.
Well, a few years later, yeah. The source states that Hans registered Rolex's famous trademark logo, that five-pointed crown.
Ah, the five-star crown, yeah.
Right. This powerful visual identifier became implemented on the dial of their watches starting in 1919, really cementing the brand's identity and adding that symbol of quality and, authority.
Okay, so 1915, the name changes. 1919, the crown logo appears. Following that, the Rolex Watch Corporation made another significant strategic move within Switzerland in 1919. Where did they go?
Yes, according to the source, the company relocated its main office again, this time from Bilbien to Geneva.
Geneva.
And the source notes that this office in Geneva is where Rolex's headquarters still stands today.
Wow. What was the thinking behind this move to Geneva? Why split things up?
Well, the source explains that this created a specific division of labor and focus within the company. The actual manufacturing of the watch movements continued back in Bilbien.
Right. Leveraging the expertise there.
Exactly, using the historical expertise of that region in component production. However, these finished movements would then be transported to Geneva.
And in Geneva.
It was in Geneva that they would undergo really careful verification for accuracy. They'd be finished with their high-class design elements, and then the final products would be launched to the market from there.
Ah, okay. So Bilbien was kind of the engine room producing the core mechanisms, while Geneva became the center for quality control, design, finishing, and basically presenting the final polished product to the world. It became the innovation and presentation hub.
That's a good way to put it. And the source specifically highlights that it was here in Geneva where Hans would really commit, fully go all in, as the source puts it, with his team to relentlessly improve the technical innovation of the wristwatch. Geneva was positioned as the place where the future of Rolex's technology would really be forged.
And that drive for innovation was intensely focused on addressing that key vulnerability of the wristwatch that Hans had identified way back, wasn't it? The whole issue of protection.
Yes, his ultimate goal, the source recounts, was to make the wristwatch truly resilient against the elements: dust, water, sweat.
Right. The source provides a really powerful quote from Wilsdorf that just lays this out so clearly.
Oh yeah, what does it say?
He said, "We must succeed in making the watch case so tight that our movements will be permanently guaranteed against damage caused by dust, perspiration, water heat, and cold. Only then will the perfect accuracy of the Rolex watch be secured."
That quote just perfectly spells out the technical challenge and his unwavering focus, doesn't it? He understood that no matter how accurate you make the movement, if the case doesn't protect it from everyday hazards, dust, sweat, water, even temperature changes, the accuracy just can't be maintained in real-world use. The case was absolutely key to unlocking the wristwatch's full potential for reliability.
And this patient determination, this relentless pursuit of the perfect case, it paid off spectacularly, according to the source.
When was this?
In 1926, after years of work in that Geneva Innovation Hub, Rolex released a new model that the source states would forever change the watch industry.
1926. This has to be the Oyster, right?
This was the legendary Rolex Oyster.
Knew it. And its groundbreaking significance, as the source states, was that it was the first ever waterproof wristwatch in history. This was the direct result of Hans Wilsdorf's obsession with creating that tightly sealed case.
How did it actually achieve this waterproofness? What did the source say about the mechanism?
Well, the source explains that this new model utilized a case that was sealed with a very tight case. Basically, this tight sealing mechanism provided optimal protection for those delicate, small watch movements housed inside, making the watch properly waterproof. The whole concept was to create this impenetrable shell, like an oyster shell, hence the name, presumably.
Right, the oyster case. And the source hinted later about how tight this was, mentioning that for the original oyster, you actually had to unscrew the crown just to wind it because it was sealed so securely.
Yeah, that shows how serious they were about the seal.
And Hans immediately recognized the magnitude of this achievement, didn't he? He knew what he had.
Oh, absolutely. The source notes that he knew this breakthrough was revolutionary and he believed there'd be significant public interest. But strategically, he decided against just, putting out a simple announcement.
No. What did he do?
Instead, he chose to wait for the perfect opportunity to demonstrate this capability to the world in a really dramatic and highly creative way. This wasn't just about the invention itself. It was about how to prove it beyond doubt.
Find the perfect stage. And that perfect opportunity, according to the source, it presented itself the following year, in 1927.
Yes. Hans heard about this remarkable feat being attempted by a woman from London named Mercedes Gleitze.
Mercedes Gleitze.
She was planning to swim across the English Channel, a formidable distance, 20.5 miles?
Yeah, that's a serious swim. But the public was skeptical of her claim, apparently.
The source indicates there was some public doubt about her capability, yeah. So to prove herself, she's planning to attempt the swim again, this time in front of thousands of spectators. And the conditions weren't great. The water temperature was apparently very cold. This created a highly visible, highly dramatic public event.
And Hans saw this as the ultimate test and the ultimate demonstration for his new oyster watch.
Exactly. He recognized the unique opportunity this challenging public endurance test offered to showcase the oyster's waterproofness in the most demanding way possible. So he encouraged Mercedes Gleitze to wear a Rolex oyster watch during her swim.
Wear it on her wrist.
The source actually specifies she wore it around her neck.
Around her neck. Okay. So how did the swim itself go for Mercedes Gleitze? Did she make it?
Well, the source describes that she swam for over 10 hours, which is incredible in itself. But ultimately, she had to be pulled from the water because of the extreme cold. She was almost freezing. She made it about 4/5 of the way across the channel. So in terms of successfully completing the entire swim, it wasn't quite a complete success for her personally.
Right. She didn't finish the crossing. But for Rolex, what happened to the watch?
This was the absolute critical outcome for Hans and the brand. The source emphasizes the result. The Rolex oyster, after enduring over 10 hours completely immersed in the cold, salty water of the English Channel, came out of the water in absolutely perfect working condition.
Perfect condition. After 10 hours in the channel. That's an incredibly compelling demonstration, isn't it?
Totally undeniable proof. Immersed for hours, freezing salt water, challenging conditions, and it emerged completely functional.
What was the public reaction?
The source states the reaction was immense. It says people went crazy for the watch after this highly publicized demonstration, and Hans strategically was ready to capitalize on that moment.
What did he do?
He immediately followed up by placing an advertisement detailing the event and, crucially, the watch's flawless performance in a prominent London newspaper, the Daily Mail.
That's brilliant, timely marketing. Using a real-world dramatic test to prove the product's key feature, then immediately telling everyone about it.
Exactly. And the source calls this pivotal moment the point where Rolex rose to international fame as a revolutionary watch. It wasn't just the invention of waterproofness, it was the spectacular public proof of it that really captured the world's attention.
And the genius marketing didn't stop with the English Channel swim, did it? The source details another incredibly clever and visual strategy Hans employed.
Oh yeah, this one's great. To further build on the hype and visually demonstrate the oyster's waterproof capability day to day, Hans implemented this strategy of displaying the watches in fish bowls.
Wait, in actual fish bowls, with real fish swimming around.
Precisely. The source says these fishbowl displays were placed right on the sale counter or in the window display of every single Rolex dealership. People walking by could literally see a working Rolex oyster watch submerged underwater, often with fish swimming around it. It offered the simple, undeniable, and totally memorable demonstration of its waterproofness.
That is genuinely genius marketing. It makes the technical feature instantly understandable and visually compelling without needing a single word of explanation.
Absolutely. And the source confirms its effectiveness, stating, "This genius strategy worked amazingly and people became hooked on the products. It just bypassed all the technical jargon and delivered one clear message. This watch works underwater. Period."
Building on this incredible momentum, Hans decided to really invest heavily in advertising from 1928 onwards.
He did. The source mentions he worked with prominent figures to promote the watches, including Evelyn Leigh, who's described as a top British model of the time.
And I bet those ads featured fish bowls.
You bet right. The source confirms that, of course, the advertising featured pictures of her wearing her wristwatch while it was submerged inside a fishbowl, just reinforcing that iconic image of waterproof reliability.
And the publicity generated by these real-world feats continued to roll in too, didn't it? Further bolstering the brand's image of toughness.
Yeah, the source recounts several other instances. In 1933, for example, Rolex oysters were featured in newspaper accounts related to a flight over Mount Everest.
Mount Everest.
Yeah. The crew members who wore their Rolexes reported with great satisfaction that their watches were still functioning perfectly after enduring the extreme conditions, the cold, the altitude of that high-altitude flight.
Wow. From the depths of the channel to the top of the world. And there was another high-profile endorsement a couple of years later, a speed record.
That's right. In 1935, the famous race car driver Malcolm Campbell, who was known for setting land speed records, wore his Rolex while setting a record of around 300 miles per hour.
300 miles per hour back then.
Incredible speed. And the source mentions that Hans specifically requested permission to publicize this fact, and Campbell agreed. Now, notably, Campbell apparently refused any payment for allowing this publicity.
Really?
Yeah, which the source highlights as adding further credibility to the watch's robustness and reliability. It was an unpaid endorsement from someone who tested equipment to the absolute extreme.
Through all these real-world demonstrations, the swim, the flight, the speed record, and the clever marketing like the fish bowls, the public perception of Rolex underwent a really significant transformation, didn't it?
It really did. The source summarizes this shift nicely. It says, at this point, people began to perceive Rolex not only as a high-quality designed watch, but also as a trustworthy, reliable, and technical wristwatch that anyone can wear for everyday use.
So it wasn't just fancy jewelry anymore.
Exactly. The brand successfully transitioned from being seen as maybe just high-end or jewelry-like to becoming a symbol of durability, technical prowess, and genuine practicality suitable for any challenge or activity.
The source also includes this interesting statement that seems to reflect a prevailing sentiment during that period of marketing success. It notes, only great marketing is needed to make a company successful.
Yeah, that quote is presented in the source as something stated during these times, so maybe reflecting a viewpoint that was common or expressed within the source material itself. But whether you agree with it fully or not, it certainly underscores the immense impact Hans Wilsdorf's innovative marketing strategies had in catapulting Rolex to fame. It highlights that proving a product's capabilities dramatically can be just as crucial as the invention itself, at least according to this perspective presented in the source.
Fair point. And Rolex certainly didn't stop innovating with just the oyster case. They kept pushing, relentlessly improving the wristwatch.
Absolutely. The source mentions that in 1931, following the huge success of the Oyster, Rolex introduced another significant update, the Rolex Oyster Perpetual.
Oyster Perpetual. What was the key innovation there? What did Perpetual add?
The source identifies it as the first ever waterproof and self-winding wristwatch.
Self-winding, okay.
So it combined the Oyster's key waterproof feature with this major new functionality, automatic winding.
Why was adding self-winding so important, especially to a waterproof watch like the Oyster? What problem did it solve?
Well, the source explains the practical problem this addressed. While the original Oyster's waterproof case was revolutionary, it did present that minor inconvenience we mentioned earlier.
The unscrewing the crown bit.
Exactly. To manually wind that watch, you had to unscrew the tight Oyster crown first, wind the watch, and then carefully screw the crown back down nice and tight to ensure the waterproof seal was restored. It was a bit cumbersome to do every day or two.
Right. And maybe a risk of not screwing it back properly and compromising the waterproofness?
Potentially, yeah. So a self-winding mechanism powered by the movement of the wearer's wrist just eliminated the need to interact with the crown for daily power. It preserved the integrity of the seal and added a huge amount of convenience.
Just wear it and stays wound.
Basically, yeah. And the source notes the historical significance of this achievement, too. It states that creating a reliable self-winding watch had been a goal for centuries. Many had tried to perfect it without real success. So the Oyster Perpetual represented a genuine breakthrough in automating the watch's power source while maintaining its crucial waterproof integrity.
Okay, so waterproof, now self-winding. The modern wristwatch is really taking shape here. The source also mentions something interesting during this period, specifically from 1934 to 1940. Hans Wilsdorf apparently tried to produce watches under his own name, separate from Rolex.
Yeah, the material notes this venture. He trademarked and produced some high-quality watches under the Hans Wilsdorf name, but it also states that this venture was ultimately discontinued.
Why? Why didn't it work out?
According to the source, the reason for stopping it was the negative sentiment, the hatred, as the source puts it, that the French, British, and U.S. markets held towards Germany during that period. This is leading up to and at the start of World War II.
The anti-German sentiment again.
Exactly. His German name likely made selling watches under that personal brand very difficult, maybe impossible, in those crucial international markets.
That really underscores how his personal identity, his German name, continued to present these challenges, even after establishing Rolex's success. It wasn't just an early issue.
It really does seem like a persistent hurdle. The source mentions that despite all his achievements and the success of Rolex, Hans would sometimes find it challenging to make his way in the market, and often felt he had to put in double the effort compared to others to make his company successful, precisely because of that German name.
Wow. And then came another global conflict that significantly impacted the business again, World War II.
Yes. When World War II broke out, the source states that Rolex took a hard hit.
How so? Wasn't it like WWI where military use helped?
Apparently not in the same way, or at least the negative impacts were more pronounced this time. The source says the global conflict made it much more difficult and significantly more expensive to export products out of Switzerland to its major markets in Europe and elsewhere. Trade routes were disrupted, economies were focused on the war.
Right. Logistical nightmares.
Exactly. The source notes that Hans was understandably frustrated with the severe disruptions this caused to his international business.
So unlike WWI, which surprisingly boosted Rolex by showcasing its utility to soldiers, WWII seems to have presented more direct negative consequences for the business side, disrupting trade, making things expensive, limiting accessibility.
That's certainly what the source implies, yeah. The wartime conditions created significant logistical and financial barriers. And adding to the difficulties, the burdens during this period, the source recounts a terrible personal tragedy that struck Hans Wilsdorf.
This is when his wife passed away.
Yes. The source mentions that to add to the hardships and bad luck, as it puts it, during WWII, his wife, Florence, died in 1944. A truly profound personal loss during an already incredibly challenging time for his business and the world.
How did he commemorate her memory? What does the source say?
The source states that, in memory of his wife, Hans established the Wilsdorf Foundation.
The Wilsdorf Foundation.
Yes. This foundation, according to the material, was set up as a charity organization specifically dedicated to supporting social causes.
And this foundation would go on to play an absolutely crucial, defining role in the very structure and future of Rolex itself, wouldn't it?
It really does, according to the source. The material makes a very significant point about what happened shortly before Hans Wilsdorf's death. It states that he transferred 100% ownership, all of it, of the Rolex company to the Wilsdorf Foundation.
100% ownership to a charity.
Yes. And the source explicitly says that, to this day, the foundation still owns and controls Rolex entirely.
Wow. And the source outlines some major implications of this unique ownership structure, right? What does it mean practically?
It does. The source states quite directly, therefore, Rolex will never go public or be sold, nor will they ever pay any taxes, because it's essentially a charity.
Okay, wait. Never go public, never be sold. That makes sense if a foundation owns it. But never pay any taxes because it's a charity. That sounds quite strong. Is that exactly what the source claims?
That is the direct statement presented in the source material, yes. It presents it as a consequence of the Wilsdorf Foundation's ownership. So, according to this source, this multi-billion-dollar global luxury brand is entirely owned and governed by a charitable entity with these specific consequences regarding its operational status and finances.
Fascinating, and a highly unusual structure for a major global luxury brand, to say the least. We should definitely circle back to that point later.
Agreed.
But despite the challenges of WWII, the personal loss, as soon as the conflict ended, the source says Rolex experienced just explosive growth. It really took off.
Yeah, it describes the post-war period vividly. It states that as soon as World War II is finished, Rolex started to take off, and tremendously. The growth wasn't just significant, it was rapid and on a massive scale.
And the source provides some specific data points to illustrate this acceleration, doesn't it? Something about chronometers.
Yes. In 1946, Rolex marked a milestone by selling its 50,000th certified Rolex chronometer.
50,000th. And the source notes they had begun certifying these watches about 20 years prior, right?
Exactly. So achieving 50,000 certified chronometers represented 2 decades of accumulated production and sales of their most accurate, independently verified timepieces.
Okay, 50,000 over 2 decades.
Yeah.
That's steady progress. But then look at the very next year. What happens in 1947?
This is where the explosion is just undeniable. By 1947, just one single year later, their sales reached their 100,000th certified Rolex chronometer.
Doubled in 1 year.
They effectively doubled the sales achieved over the previous 2 decades in a single year. The source highlights this remarkable speed. That is truly tremendous post-war acceleration and demand.
Doubling 2 decades of sales in just 12 months is absolutely incredible. What was fueling this incredible growth, according to the source? Was it just pent-up demand?
Well, the source attributes this post-war success, at least in part, to the introduction of new, innovative models that were released around this time, building on the strong foundations of the Oyster and the Oyster Perpetual.
Like what? What came next?
In 1945, for example, they released the Rolex Datejust.
The Datejust, still a classic today. What made the Datejust a landmark model back then, according to the source?
The source states that the Datejust was the first waterproof, self-winding wristwatch to also include an indication of the date of the month right there on the dial.
The date window.
Exactly. This combined the technical achievements of the Oyster Perpetual waterproof, self-winding with this highly practical calendar complication integrated onto the dial.
Adding functionality that would basically become standard in everyday watches later on.
Pretty much. And nearly a decade after that, in the 1950s, came another crucial innovation, the Rolex Day Date.
Day date. Okay, so adding the day of the week as well.
Exactly. The source describes this model as the first waterproof and self-winding wristwatch to include both the date of the month and the day of the week spelled out on the dial. These were significant steps in making the wristwatch an even more comprehensive and useful tool, going beyond just telling the time.
These complications, the date, the day date, they seem so fundamental now, don't they? Almost expected on a watch.
They really do. And the source reinforces their importance by noting that these types of watches are still seen today and are often considered the standard for normal everyday use of wristwatches. Wilsdorf's innovations in adding these practical complications to reliable, waterproof, self-winding watches really set a benchmark for modern timepieces.
Okay, so the 1950s, as the source notes, continue this trend of releasing really innovative watches. It wasn't just the day date.
No, indeed. The source indicates that the 1950s saw a whole series of significant new models coming out from Rolex, a really inventive period.
And among these, the source highlights one that has become truly legendary, maybe the most iconic tool watch ever.
I think I know which one you mean. That would be the Rolex Submariner, right? Introduced in 1953.
The Submariner, exactly. It's iconic, particularly in the diving world. What was its defining capability? What made it so special, according to the source material?
Well, the source explicitly states that the Submariner was the first deep-diving waterproof wristwatch. It pushed the boundaries of water resistance significantly further than the original Oyster. It was designed specifically to withstand depths of up to 100 meters in the ocean without suffering damage or becoming dysfunctional.
100 meters. That's serious depth back in 53.
Absolutely. This solidified Rolex's reputation for creating these purpose-built, ultra-robust tool watches designed for specific demanding professions or activities.
A true testament to that continued focus on technical innovation that really began with Wilsdorf's desire for that perfectly sealed case all those years ago.
It all connects back, yeah.
Hans Wilsdorf lived to see much of this incredible post-war growth and innovation, the Datejust, the Day Date, the Submariner. But the source states he passed away in 1960.
1960. So what happened to the strategic direction of the company after his death? Did it change much without him at the helm, according to the source?
Well, the source notes that following Hans Wilsdorf's passing, Rolex began to evolve, or perhaps consciously shifted, into the luxury brand it is primarily known as today.
Okay. So a shift in focus after the founder's death. How did this manifest? What did they do differently, according to the source?
The material indicates that the company's marketing strategy began to shift more towards positioning Rolex as an exclusive watch collection, specifically targeting people of high society, making it more aspirational, perhaps.
Right, moving beyond just technical prowess to emphasize status and exclusivity.
Exactly. And the source adds, quite directly, that this strategic focus on the luxury market worked. It was successful in shaping the brand image we see now.
So a deliberate move to cultivate that image of exclusivity and status, building on the technical foundation and the reputation for reliability established during Wilsdorf's lifetime.
That's certainly what the source implies, yeah. It suggests as a conscious decision to target a specific high-end demographic with their branding and positioning. The source also mentions another factor contributing to the, let's say, high price point of Rolex watches today: material innovation.
Oh yeah, what specific material innovation does it mention?
The source notes that in 1985, Rolex began manufacturing their watches using 904L steel.
904L steel, what's special about that?
Well, the material describes it as a very durable and expensive steel. And significantly, the source states that Rolex was the first watch company to ever utilize this particular grade of steel.
And it's presented in the source as one of the reasons contributing to their expensive prices today. This indicates a continued commitment long after Wilsdorf to using high quality and, yes, costly materials in their manufacturing processes.
So the modern Rolex brand, as presented in this source, is really a result of this blend of elements. The undeniable legacy of technical innovation from Wilsdorf's era.
the foundation.
A strategic shift towards luxury and exclusivity in marketing after his death, and this ongoing commitment to using advanced high-cost materials like that 904L steel.
Exactly. And the source brings the story to a conclusion by noting that Rolex today remains arguably the most recognizable watch brand in the entire world.
And it all originated.
Yeah.
Right back with that orphan boy with a vision. It's quite the story.
It really is. The source provides this concise summary of his incredible journey. From an orphan boy who started with nothing, Hans Wilsdorf went for his own path and is responsible for changing the watch industry to what we know today. His individual journey, marked by so much adversity and determination, directly led to a fundamental transformation of an entire industry.
His relentless passion for improvement, for making the wristwatch better, more reliable, more useful, it truly redefined timekeeping on the wrist.
Absolutely. The source concludes by stating that Hans Wilsdorf's passion for both design and technical innovation has secured his place on the list of the most influential men in the watch industry. And the source suggests his enduring legacy can be seen today in every person wearing a Rolex.
What an incredible journey we've traced, just drawing from the source material provided here. We followed Hans Wilsdorf from those profound challenges of his early childhood, being orphaned at 12, navigating depression, feeling like an outsider, yet somehow finding focus through education and developing that crucial self-reliance.
Yeah, and we saw his early steps into the world of business with the Pearl Company, getting that commercial grounding, and then his crucial immersion into the actual watchmaking craft at Kuno Cordon in La Chaux-de-Fonds, absorbing all that vital knowledge despite interruptions like army service.
Then his move to London, securing vital experience in sales, meeting Florence and crucially her brother Alfred Davis, and that pivotal investment that launched Wilsdorf and Davis in 1905.
Yeah.
All driven by his bold, almost contrarian vision that the wristwatch, not the pocket watch, was the future.
And his tireless pursuit of technical perfection, traveling to learn, constantly refining designs right from 1905, recognizing the need for a strong, memorable international name, leading to the creation and trademarking of Rolex in 1908, just relentless.
Then the unexpected crucible of World War I, which, bizarrely, inadvertently proved the wristwatch's reliability and utility to soldiers, boosting Rolex's fame, yet also bringing challenges like those British export taxes, and the anti-German sentiment that prompted the strategic relocation back to Switzerland, and the formal adoption of the Rolex Watch Corporation name, and that iconic crown logo.
Right, and the centralization of operations in Geneva as the focused innovation hub, fueled by Wilsdorf's singular goal, protecting the movement from the elements, which culminated, of course, in the revolutionary waterproof Rolex Oyster in 1926.
And the absolute masterclass in strategic marketing that followed, using those dramatic real-world tests like the Mercedes Glides to Swim and the brilliantly simple fishbowl displays to translate that technical achievement into undeniable public appeal and international fame. Genius.
Total genius. And the continuous drive for technical superiority after the Oyster, leading to groundbreaking innovations like the self-winding Oyster Perpetual in 1931, solving the winding issue of the original Oyster, and then the post-war development of essential complications like the date just and day date, setting new standards for everyday wristwatch functionality.
And doing all this despite personal loss, like his wife Florence's passing, and the significant business disruptions of World War II.
And yet, he still had the foresight to ensure the long-term future and independence of the company by transferring 100% ownership to the Wilsdorf Foundation, that charity dedicated to social causes. This unique structure, as noted in our source, means Rolex is owned and controlled by a foundation, with those specific implications mentioned in the source regarding it never going public, being sold, or as the source claims, paying taxes because it's a charity.
Leading into that explosive post-war growth we saw, the rapid doubling of certified chronometer sales, and the continued innovation in iconic models like the legendary Submariner in 1953, and later material advancements like using 904L steel, all solidifying Rolex's position as a leader in both engineering and luxury.
It's just a truly remarkable story, isn't it, of one individual's vision, resilience, technical brilliance, and marketing acumen fundamentally changing an industry and creating a brand that still endures as this global icon.
So as you, our listener, reflect on this story, drawing from the source material we've unpacked, what aspects really resonate most with you? Is it Hans Wilsdorf's incredible resilience, facing being orphaned and navigating all that adversity? Is it his remarkable foresight in seeing the potential of the wristwatch when pretty much everyone else dismissed it?
Or perhaps it's the strategic genius behind his marketing, how he proved the technical superiority of his watches in such memorable, dramatic ways. Or is it maybe just that relentless, continuous drive for technical perfection that defined the company under his leadership for so long?
And maybe consider again that truly unique ownership structure of Rolex under the Wilsdorf Foundation, as described in our source, a charity that owns and controls this vast, multi-billion-dollar luxury brand with those specific implications stated in the source regarding its status and operations.
What might this unusual model suggest about Hans Wilsdorf's ultimate priorities, his vision for his legacy? Extending perhaps beyond simply building a profitable business. It raises a really fascinating question, doesn't it? About the intersection of immense commercial success and charitable purpose.
It certainly gives you something to think about, doesn't it? A multi-billion-dollar symbol of status and wealth, controlled entirely by charity, all stemming from one man's journey from being an orphan boy. Definitely something to mull over as you go about your day.